I'm James R. Balkcom Jr. I'm known as Jim. If you get to know my wife, then they'll call me Jimmy. All my good friends call me Jimmy. That's what they called me in high school. At West Point, they called me Balkcom X. It's a story I'll tell you about my B Squad football experience. And my wife also calls me Bean. So, but Jim is preferred. My wife would say Jimmy is preferred. Okay. Born in Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia on the 19th of May, 1944. My dad was in the Army Air Corps when I was born, and my mom was working as a legal secretary. Grew up as a blue-collar kid. Lived in the basement apartment of my grandmother and grandfather's house on West Paces Ferry Road before the rich people moved to West Paces Ferry Road. And lived there for 6 years. My daddy became a traveling salesman when he got out of the service. He had spent 1 year at Emory University, but when he got back from the war, and I would say Daddy didn't really fight in the war. He washed out in Army Air Corps training at Fort Sam Houston, where I spent my first year of life. And then went in the Air Force Reserve, where he was for 17 years. He was a traveling salesman. I would tell you that my mother was one of the most aggressive women that I'd ever known, and I think I got my spark from her. My daddy was all about integrity and character, and not very aggressive. But I think that's where I got the appreciation for telling the truth from Daddy. Went to Cross Keys High School out in the DeKalb County area, where I was a pretty good athlete. None of the skill sports, though. When I played basketball, I used to hit the bottom of the rim instead of the top of the rim. But I played football, wrestled, and we won the state wrestling championship my junior year, and ran track. One of the toughest times of my life occurred on February the 10th of 1962, which was February of my senior year in high school. And my mother died of cancer. Now back then we didn't know what kind of cancer it was. It may have been lung cancer. It was in her chest. She went to Emory Hospital. They cut her open, sewed her back up. 6 months later, she was dead. So that was a traumatic experience for a young 17-year-old. And so I watched her die, and then it put me in the bed for a month. So here's this strapping. Believe it or not, I weighed about 205 pounds. I had an 18-inch neck, and and I was small, but I was slow. So I went to bed for a month with mononucleosis, they called it at the time. It looked like I was going to go to Georgia Tech when I graduated from high school, because Daddy had always talked about Georgia Tech, and it was close, and I was going to live at home and work. I worked summers construction. So I didn't apply anywhere else except West Point. The West Point story goes like this. I really hadn't ever considered West Point. I'm not one of these guys that always wanted to go to West Point all his life. One of the coaches, one of the assistant coaches from West Point came through our high school one day and asked my coach if he had any student athletes, and he said, well, you ought to talk to Jimmy Balkcom. And so he came, and I said, where's West Point? This was my junior year in high school. And he told me, and I said, well, this is a free education, sounds good. So I applied to West Point for entry after I graduated my senior year. And I didn't get in. I got a first alternate appointment. I qualified medically, physically, academically, but the principal appointee took the appointment, so I didn't get in. And I was crushed. obviously, and I hadn't applied anywhere else. So I applied to Tech very late, and they said, sorry, it's too late. You'll have to enter as a second quarter freshman. So if you want to go this summer, so I graduate from high school, go this summer, and then you can enter in the fall as a second quarter freshman. And one of my life experiences is watching my dad put his golf clubs down and his fishing rod down and raised my little brother, who was 14 when she died, and my little sister, who was about to turn 5. And so he just turned inside to the house, fixed her lunch every day till she got out of high school, and I watched a man take care of his family, and that was something that impressed me. Of course, I was out of the house. I was working and going to Tech, so I walked on to play football at Georgia Tech. At my 205 pound, probably ran the 100-yard dash in about 15 seconds. And so I was third string center. So I held the pads for the varsity and those kinds of things. But we played back then, back in the dark ages, there was a freshman football team. Freshmen could not play varsity, so we had a freshman football schedule. And I hadn't really played much, but the big game was the Scottish Rite Hospital Thanksgiving Day football game between the Georgia and Georgia Tech freshmen. And during warm-up, the two centers that played in front of me got hurt during warm-up. One of them broke his ankle practicing kickoffs, one of them pulled a muscle, and they looked around and said, you know, who is this, what's that kid's name that's, oh, Balkcom, oh, they call me Balkcom. Balkcom, that must be, send him in. So I start at the Georgia Tech, you know, in front of 40,000 people from Cross Keys High School. So we get the ball, and we receive the ball, and on the first drive, we take the ball down to about the 7-yard line and bog down. So send the field goal kicker in. Well, I had about a 280-pound nose guard over me, and he was just beating my brains out. And so I snapped the ball for the field goal, and not only did it go over the holder's head, it went over the kicker's head and landed about the 50-yard line. So I still hold the record in Grant Field, Atlanta, Georgia, for the longest snap from center. People don't remember the football game, but they remember that snap, and they say, was that you? I say, that was me. And I thought the West Point thing was gone, and all of a sudden, I get a letter from my congressman and my senator, Talmadge, and they said, would you like to go to West Point? And I said, yes, I would. So 4 quarters at Tech, and then off to West Point. So I entered West Point on June the 7th, 1963. Had visions of playing football there. Entered West Point weighing about 197 pounds. And after Beast Barracks, I weighed about 170 pounds. And they said, we don't need you on the football team. So my athletic involvement at West, of course, at West Point, you've got to participate in a sport year-round, whether it's club sport or varsity sport. Didn't make any difference. You just had to participate. So I played junior varsity football, B squad, which was a lot more fun than varsity football. We got to travel and play 5 or 6 games, and again, I was pretty average. My closest friend, Jimmy Walden, who's from Rome, Georgia, played football in the junior varsity, and we were playing Seton Hall at West Point in the rain. And he went back to punt. And I snapped the ball, and it landed about 2 feet in front of him and scooted between his legs in the water. And I stood up and turned around and said, look out. And 2 guys blew by me and just killed him. So I'm not one of his favorite people. But that's kind of my football story. I played rugby Senior year, we beat Notre Dame. It was a club sport back then. Senior year, we beat Notre Dame for the national championship, which is my only claim to fame. West Point was not fun for me. It was one of the most intense experiences of my life. I thought if I could graduate and get out of there that I would never, ever come back. I didn't want to see the place. It was just, the best thing that ever happened to me was going to Tech for a year because it set me up academically to get through West Point. I was a company commander, a cadet captain when I graduated, and Company F1 won the Commandant's Trophy for the best marching company in the Corps of Cadets. An incident that happened at West Point that falls under the category of snapping balls over people's head was that Jimmy Walden and I decided to go to Canada for Expo 67. So we took a long weekend leave about 3 weeks before graduation and drove to Montreal for Expo 67, drove home. On the way home, we decided we'd stop in Highland Falls right outside the gates, which was off limits, to get a six-pack of beer for the nice man that was letting us stay in his house that evening. And about 6 tactical officers were in the bar when I walked in, naively. And so I spent, here I am, a cadet captain, company commander. My father drove up with my aunt, and so I was walking the area during June week. And they finally came about 2 days before graduation and let me get off the area and join the company. So, graduated from West Point, and on June 7th, 1967, on June 30th, I married my high school sweetheart, Linda Purcell, and I met 10th grade, Cross Keys High School. And she's been my girlfriend ever since. And we've been married, the 30th of June will be 49 years. And I've never had another girlfriend. One woman man. And more about Linda later, who has been key in anything and everything I've ever accomplished. So graduate from West Point. Had to go to Ranger School. Graduate in 1967 into the gun barrel of Vietnam. Because of a man named General Michael Matthew Thomas Rienzi, I and about 12 or 15 of my best friends went Signal Corps. But if you were a second lieutenant in 1967 and could carry a rifle, you went into battle in Vietnam. So, Ranger School, 2 years in Germany, stationed with the 3rd Armored Division in Frankfurt, Germany. I commanded a platoon of the 143rd Signal Battalion, which was in support command of the 3rd Armored Division, for about 2 months, and then became a company commander as a first lieutenant. And I commanded a company for Charlie Brown, who I'll mention more in a minute. Charlie Brown was the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Army. He was 35 years old, way below the zone, and one of the finest leaders I've ever known. So I had the privilege of serving as a company commander for Charlie. And he would call my wife every once in a while and say, "Linda, would you please ask Jimmy to stop yelling at me?" And you know, in a life, people ask me now often, where did you learn servant leadership? And I've been a member of the Servant Leadership Institute. But where I learned servant leadership was my 4 years in the Army. West Point had nothing to do with it. I credit West Point for a lot, but not the servant leadership experience. So 4 years in the Army. an experience that I'll tell you about, that as a company commander at the 143rd Signal Battalion, I had a young man, Spec 4, come to me and say, "Lieutenant Balkcom, my wife's been in an accident and home, lived in Indiana, I think, and an automobile accident. She's in the hospital and I need to go home." I said, "Okay, good." And so I went through the ropes. I went to Colonel Brown. We went through the JAG and tried to get emergency leave to get him home, and he didn't qualify for emergency leave. The Army didn't meet the regulations, so they wouldn't let him go home. And that's one of the times I yelled at Colonel Brown. I said, "This isn't right. His wife's been injured. He needs to go home. Sorry, doesn't meet it. We can't grant him emergency leave." So I put him in the car and took him downtown and arranged for him to borrow the money, to buy an airplane ticket to get home. I gave him the leave, sent him home. 2 weeks later, his wife died. The people in my company understood from that point forward that I cared more about them than I did the Army or anything else. As Zig Ziglar said, the way you get what you want in life is help other people get what they want in life. So that was a servant leadership example early in my career. So I'm company commander for the Company A, 143rd Signal Battalion, and my wife goes to lunch at one of these, at the Officers Club, at a Officers Wives Club luncheon. And she sits at the table with the commanding general's wife. And her name was Loie Coles. He was Major General Donald H. Coles, a swashbuckling tanker who served with Creighton Abrams in the Battle of the Bulge. He was tank commander, and Abrams was his company commander. So Mrs. Coles meets Linda, and anybody that meets Linda falls in love with Linda. She's the outgoing. She goes into a room, and people want to meet her. I go into a room and stand in the corner. I'm the introvert. So she goes back to her husband and says, "It's about time for you to get a new aide, I know, and I don't know if he's any good, but I want his wife." She's the cutest thing I've ever met. She's just perfect, and I love her. So he calls Charlie Brown, Colonel Brown, and says, "You got a guy in your battalion named Jim Balkcom?" And he said, and I quote, "He's the best I got," end quote. He says, "Well, General Coles would like to talk to him about being his aide." Well, Charlie Brown said, "A Signal Corps lieutenant in the Armor Division?" General Coles said, "Let me interview him." So I spent an hour and a half with General Coles, and was asked to be the general's aide, which really frosted 33 armor lieutenants and captains. But it was another incredible godsend for me. Working for Charlie Brown, first, Colonel Brown, as his wife tells me, just what you used to call him, Jimmy, became one of the few 3-star Signal Corps generals ever served. Back in those times, before Cyber Command, it was very unusual. So Colonel Brown got 3 stars. So I go over to work for General Coles, who was an ROTC, University of Massachusetts, and the finest leader I've ever known in my life. And he brought me in. He would bring in his commanders. He would go to Garmisch, or he'd go to Brussels for a meeting, and he'd take me and he'd let me sit in with the 3- and 4-star generals and listen to what was going on. It was just the most incredible experience a young kid could have. I used to go with him when he reviewed the troops and would watch him make a PFC standing in formation feel like that General Coles cared about him and his family. And that's where I started digesting servant leadership. Just to fast forward a little bit on the General Coles story. When I was on my way, Linda and I were on our way back to Harvard Business School for my second year at Harvard, we stopped at Fort Myer and spent the night with a Coles. He was then, General Abrams, Chief of Staff of the Army, and General Coles was a 3-star then, and he was Chief of Staff for Operations. We were sitting on the front porch talking. And I said, General Coles, what can somebody like me do for somebody like you who's done so much for me? And he didn't skip a beat. He didn't take a breath. He looked at me and said, Jimmy, go do it for somebody else. Servant leadership. So, 2 years in Germany, a year. I was General Coles' aide for 6 months before he was called to Vietnam. He was called to Vietnam to be, Abrams had just gone, so he went to be Abrams' Chief of Staff in Vietnam. So I rotate back to the States with Linda and Julie, who was then about a year old. She was born in Germany. And I wrote back, go to jump school in between Germany and deploying for Vietnam. So I was deploying to Vietnam and was assigned to the Americal Division. On my way into Vietnam, I was diverted. I was diverted by a general who was then a major general who ran the 1st Signal Brigade. And I guess he and General Coles talked. And so I was diverted to the 1st Signal Brigade and was assigned to a job that had been held by a major who'd been relieved, and I was a fresh captain, to take over the largest signal site in Vietnam, which was on Vung Chua Mountain, about 3,000 feet above the Bay of Quy Nhon in 2 Corps. And we had 265 men on top of Vung Chua Mountain. We provided strategic communications throughout the country and back to the world, plus the tactical communications for the 173rd and all the troops operating in the area. And Vung Chua Mountain was not secure. We had 24 bunkers, which we manned 24 hours a day. I had a mortar squad, I had an MP platoon that we ran patrols with, and then the rest were manning the communications equipment and manning the bunkers. Best job I ever had in my life. Just incredible leadership, servant leadership experience. In order to come home alive, I figured out early on, I needed to make sure that I got every one of my men home alive. If I took care of them, they'd take care of me. So for those 366 days, and back then you commanded for 6 months, and then you were in a staff job for 6 months. So I should have commanded for 6 months, come down the hill and joined the battalion as the S1 or S2 or S3. After commanding for 6 months, they asked me to command for another 6 months, which I was more than happy to do. We had taken the worst signal site in Vietnam, and in 3 months was awarded by the commanding general of Vietnam as the best signal site in Vietnam. I got 2 or 3 hours sleep a night for 366 days, because during the night I went from bunker to bunker to bunker to bunker. This was I have to tell you that this was a time of winding down in Vietnam. This was 1970. So people say, gee, you're in a lot of firefights. No, we got breached twice, but we were in a strategic position. We blew them away. We're looking down at them, so that was not a problem. The problem was the mental health of the troops in a wind down with Jane Fonda and what was going on in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. It was a time of extremely low morale, so I had to make this a place where people wanted to be. And as a matter of fact, we had the best troops who wanted to get transferred up to Vung Chua Mountain. And so it was just it was a tough time because of marijuana, drugs, the winding down of the war. So this going around to the bunkers all night kept the drugs out, kept the troops awake. They knew Balkcom was coming around, but I knew them all by first name. I knew their wives' names. I knew their kids if they had kids. I knew what their aspirations were. I knew what they wanted to do when they got out. Of all 265 people on the site, something I learned from Charlie Brown and General Coles. So one of the most intense times of my life, but one of the best. It's where I learned leadership. It's where I learned servant leadership. It's where I got the reality of loving your men and taking care of your men and understanding. We lost one. And people say to me, oh man, that's great. That's wonderful. You only lost one person. I said, yeah, that was 100% of that family's son. And you know, tough day to identifying the body and actually carrying his body and putting it on the helicopter was tough. But while I'm in Vietnam, I get a letter from Branch that says, you're one of our guys, we want you to stay in the service. What would you like to do? We'll send you to career course. We'll give you another command. We'll send you to graduate school. So I wrote him back and I said, funny you should ask, because I was thinking about getting out of the service. The market was shrinking. What was going on in Vietnam then is what's going on right now. Indiscriminate cutback. We just want to get the troop strength down. We're going to let the good, the bad, and the ugly out. And there was no discrimination about, here are our top guys, let's keep them, and let's let these other guys out. It was just, anybody, it was a rift. Anybody that wants out, out. And I said to myself, it's going to be 13 years until I'm a lieutenant colonel and I get to command again. And this is an indiscriminate cutback. It might make sense for me to try my luck somewhere else. And so I get this letter from Branch, and it says, we'll send you to graduate school. And so I wrote him back and I said, okay, I was thinking about getting out, but if you'll send me to Harvard, Wharton, or Stanford, I'll stay in. Because I said, look, if I'm going to be a general officer, I want to be able to communicate at the same level with the civilians in the world. Well, Branch wrote me back and said, that's not what we had in mind. We'll send you to Georgia Tech in operations research, and besides that, we don't think you can get into Harvard because you didn't finish high enough in your class at West Point. I finished about 180 out of 583. So I said, fine, and I applied to Harvard. And I had to take the ATGSB, or the graduate entrance exam. So I get a patrol together, and we move down the hill to Quinyon, and I go in to take the ATGSB in a trailer that's bunkered in. Great story. And I start taking the test. And I'm not doing well. I can tell I'm not doing well on this test. But then we started taking mortar rounds. So I had to put my flak vest on, my helmet on, run out, get in the bunker, and return fire. It's a time test, so we get back in. So after we repel the attack, I go back into the trailer, and the time's up, and I finished about half the test. And on the back page, about half the page was blank, and it said, "Do you have anything else to say?" And I wrote across it, "We are under attack." Well, I rotated home. I told Linda, look, I'm not getting in. I didn't do well on the test. I didn't finish the tests, so we've got to figure something else out. I was so sure I wasn't going to get in that I did not apply for financial aid, which is something I didn't tell Linda for about 5 years. Well, to Harvard Business School's everlasting credit, I get a letter in the mail 2 weeks later, and I've been accepted to Harvard. So we pack up our bags, pack up our child, put a trailer on the back of the car, and drive to Brighton, Massachusetts, where we lived in low-income housing, the projects, because I qualified. And by the way, with 2 Naval Academy graduates who were going back to Harvard, who were in the same state I was in. And I went to the loan window at Harvard and borrowed $35,000 over the next 2 years, plus the $5,000 or $6,000 I got on the GI Bill. And Linda took care of Julie, who was 2 at the time, and typed my papers for me. And you know, a big night out was McDonald's for us. I mean, it was paupers going to graduate school. So I entered Harvard Business School and was convinced that I jumped in over my head. I go to my first day of class, and I'm sitting in class with the valedictorians and the salutatorians from Yale and Princeton and Cornell, and I said, "Balkcom, you have bitten off more than you can chew." And the first day, the professor, Ted Levitt, walks in and throws his books on the desk and turns to a guy and says, "Mr. Bowers, will you begin?" Well, I sucked up my seat. You know, I said, "Oh, okay." But the first time one of those students opened their mouth, I said to myself, "Balkcom, you can do this." Because I had the 4 years experience that I'd had in the Army, and these were smart, and very, very successful, became very, very successful people, but they didn't have the experience that I had. And so Harvard was not that big a push for me as I thought it was when I entered. And the third day that I was at Harvard, I ran into one of my classmates, Townsend Clark, who just in the last 3 weeks was elected into the West Point Hall of Fame as an All-American linebacker. I think Townie finished about 5th from the bottom of the class. And I said, "Townie, what are you doing here?" And he said, "Same thing you're doing here." Little did I know, but at the time, may not be true today, but the largest group of undergraduates that went to Harvard Business School at that time had gone to Harvard University. And the second largest group were West Pointers. And it was just Harvard Business School's experience with West Pointers. May not be the smartest guys in the world, but they put their head down and plow through it. So we spent 2 years at Harvard, which was not a social experience for us because we didn't get to socialize. We lived out in the hinterlands, and I drove my little Volkswagen hatchback that I brought back from Germany for the 2 years that we were there. So I graduated from Harvard in May of 1973, and I took the road less traveled. I interviewed with my class. I had some great offers, finance I majored in finance at Harvard because I'd never had an accounting course. At West Point, we didn't study finance. So majored in finance and had great offers, but they were all Wall Street, University, downtown Chicago, those kinds of things. And Lynn and I wanted to go home to Atlanta. Lifestyle was more important. So my class averaged about $90,000 starting salary that year, and I took a job making $22,000 at Peachtree Bank in Doraville, Georgia. And did that for 3.5 years. Went to work for a great guy, the guy that my father had flown with in the Air Force Reserve, Charlie Gendon. Wonderful man. He was president of the bank, and it was one of the small independent banks, 5% owned by SunTrust. So I became the branch manager of the largest branch, and I helped them open about 6 branches, and I put a strategic plan together for the bank, which, strangely enough, we executed. But after about 3.5 years, the Lord spoke to me, and I don't say that lightly. It was time for me to do something else. So I went down to Charlie's office, and I sat down with him. And I hadn't sent a resume out. I hadn't done anything. I said, Charlie, I want you to help me do something. He said, Jimmy, I'll do anything in the world for you. I said, I want you to help me find another job. It crushed him. As a matter of fact, it damaged our relationship for about 5 years. It took about 5 years for us to put that relationship back together. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But he said, we worked out a deal where I'd stay on for 90 days while he found somebody to replace me, and I trained them and got them ready to take over my position. I was the heir apparent at the bank, but I was 32 and he was 42. And so it was going to be a long time, A, and B, I decided if I had the opportunity to be president of this bank, I don't think that's what I want to do. I want to go lead something. I want to go build something. As Linda would say, Jimmy was going to lead something. He didn't know what it was going to be. He might have ended up making matches, but he'd make matches better than anybody else would make them. So, by the way, this is where my prayer life had started picking up. Really started picking up at Harvard. I'm a jogger until I had my knee replaced about 3 years ago. I'm a jogger, and that's when I talk to the Lord, and sometimes he talks to me. And he said, it's time for you to do something else. You've checked the finance box. Do something else. So I went on this massive job search. Linda, this is before email. Linda types about 300 letters for me. I interviewed anybody that moved. Well, we don't have a position. I said, I don't care. I just want to talk to you. Just get the experience of interviewing, talk to people, get their experiences, et cetera, et cetera. I had 5 significant offers. One in California, one in Chicago, CFO of a large company in Atlanta, Charlotte, somewhere else. All making more money than I ever thought I'd make, but they're all financial services. And I said, I've checked that box. I want to go, I want to lead, I want to build. So we were about 30 days out from having to leave the bank. No severance package. No, I was $35,000 in debt to Harvard, and it just, with his GI Bill, it just paid 125%, got 125% loan for a house, our first house. So it wasn't looking good. And so spent a lot of time on my knees saying, you know, Lord, and jogging, Lord, what would you have me do? I don't feel like this is what you want me to do. Phone rings in my office one day at the bank and it says, this is Yank Dean with Allied Sports Company in Eufaula, Alabama. And I said, okay. I said, do you make bicycles or jock straps? He said, no, we're down here. I said, where is Eufaula? He says, well, it's in Alabama. It's below Columbus. I said, okay, well, what does Allied Sports Company do? He said, well, we make fish finders. And I said, well, what's a fish finder? And he says, well, you know, it's sonar, and it shows you where the fish are and where the bottom is and those kind of things. And I said, fine. He said, well, your name's been given to me. My resume had made it. Arthur Anderson did the audit at the bank, and they did the audit at American Buildings Company in Eufaula, which was founded by a Georgia Tech graduate. And he was an angel investor in this little startup company that was buying Heath kits and making an electrical change to it to take the engine noise out and building these little fish finders and selling them out of the trunks of their cars. And they needed somebody to come run the business because Yank Dean, the founder, wanted to go do something else. And he was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed entrepreneur. And I said, thank you very much, but I'm not interested. Click. And you know, I went home, mentioned it to Linda, and she said, thank you very much. And phone rang a couple of days later, and he said, Jim, this is Yank Dean again, and I just want you to come down here. I know you're working hard. I understand you've been interviewing for 60 days, and we're on the lake down here. Bring your wife down, spend the weekend, and just relax. We'll pay for it. So I went home, told her, and she said, okay. True story. So we get in the car and we try it. We're mapping our lap before GPS, and we're trying to find Eufaula. And so we're down 431, and we get to this big lake, and I pull over the side of the road, and I've got the map in my lap, and as I said to her, I think we're here. 3 chickens crossed the road in front of us. And she said, oh, dear God. So we went, and I showed up the next morning at the Holiday Inn in my 3-piece pinstripe suit. You know, I mean, what else would you expect? West Point, Harvard Business School, banker, 3-piece pinstripe suit. And Yank roars up on a motorcycle. Jeans, cowboy shirt, full beard, and wooden beads around his neck. And his eyes twinkle because he was, when you look in the dictionary, entrepreneur is a picture of Yank Dean. But there was this immediate opposites attract. I mean, I was this is how you do it, 1 through 10. We'll do it at 7 o'clock in the morning, and everybody shows up, boom, 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 but we will plan and we will execute the plan. And Yank was just off the wall. So we spent the day with Yank and his wife, etc. And Linda's laying in the Holiday Inn, looking up at the ceiling with tears running down her face, saying, I don't want to live in Eufaula. And I said, you don't have to live in Eufaula. And we went home and called him up and said, thanks, but no thanks. We're 3 weeks away from, got to do something. You got to fish, cut bait, Balkcom. Of course, Allied Sports Company was in the fish. I didn't fish. I knew nothing about the industry. So it didn't make sense. But we're on our knees praying, and something's going on. And I get up one morning, I say to Linda, I've got to go back down there and just bring closure to this thing. Something's going on. My gut's telling me something. By the way, in my 72 years, the Lord talks to me through my gut. And when I have a gut feel about something, I've learned it's somebody telling me which direction to go. So I drive back down there and spend the day with Yank. And I was intrigued. And I caught a glimpse of opportunity. There were 10 employees, a little concrete building, but it was an opportunity to build something. It was an opportunity to lead people. And so as I'm driving back home on 431 North, heading to Atlanta, and I'm praying, God, I've never asked you this before, but would you give me a sign? Would you help me out with what I'm supposed to do? And as I'm passing Lake Point State Park Resort, without emotion, tears started squirting from my tear ducts. And I said, I hear you, Lord. So I drive home, and Linda will tell you today, to my everlasting credit, I did not come home and say, Linda, the Lord has spoken to me, we're supposed to go to Eufaula. I came home and I said, I really think we ought to think about this. And so we stayed up till 2 or 3 o'clock that morning on our knees, praying and thinking about it. And Linda turned to me. Understand, I would never have gone to Eufaula, Alabama, had Linda not done this, because we were a team. And she said, I tell you what, let's go for a year. If you'll promise me that after a year, if I'm miserable, that we'll leave. And she said, and I'll even join the garden club. I'll give it, I'll be all in for a year, but if it's not working for me and the kids, I had another little girl by then, so I had a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, or 7 and a 3 when we went. If you'll promise me we'll leave. I said, absolutely. I said, look, you can't be any farther behind than we are right now with the money we owe and all that, so you can't fall off the floor. So we can't lose anything in a year. So Linda let us go for a year. And so I got commuted for 7 or 8 months, because this was in the 1973 real estate depression in Atlanta, and we couldn't sell our home. So I'm driving back and forth. Of course, I drive through Fort Benning on the way there and on the way back every weekend, and get to see the troops out there and remember how much I hated Ranger School. So I'm out, I've been there about 11 months, and it's going okay, and I'm the chief operating officer. We'd have leadership meetings on Monday mornings at 7 o'clock, and Yank, the owner and CEO, would be there, and I'd be running the meeting. Yank, have you done this? Yank, have you done that? You know, et cetera. And I was in charge of everything but engineering, because he was an Auburn engineer who'd been at Texas Instruments. So 11 months after we went there, I'm out one Saturday morning jogging, and somebody pulls up alongside of me and says, Jim, Yank Dean has just dropped dead in the middle of the road jogging. He was on the other side of town jogging. He was 42 years old, had a congenital heart problem. We knew he had a congenital heart problem, but he made everybody think he was going to live forever, so he dropped dead. So there I am with 13 employees, a group of about 6 angel investors who'd each put about $20,000 into the business. And I looked at them and said, I ain't much, but I'm all you got. And so the decision was made for us, you know, if you will. So 11 months into it, we weren't going to leave after 12 months. And so I took over as the CEO of the company about 2 weeks after Yank's death, which was a traumatic experience for me. Whereas a lot of people would think that I was just waiting to be the CEO, having the opportunity to work around this guy, I had made the decision about 9 months into it that I'd rather be his COO than be CEO myself, because I was learning so much from him about entrepreneurship, and engineering and those kinds of things. And I was doing the building I wanted to do. So I was tickled, and I had stock options and ownership and that kind of thing. So financially, it was going to be okay down the road. I thought I had an opportunity to buy 10% of the company over a period of time, which was my first equity opportunity ever. So I was devastated by Yank's death, just because of the personal interaction I had with Yank. So the first thing I decided to do that had to be done was to build a leadership team so that the company would not be in this shape should something happen to me. And so I go hire, a guy calls me up from Texas Instruments and says, "This is Roger Bryant. I used to work for Yank out here. I heard he just died." And I said, "Yes, he did." I said, "I've heard about you, Roger. I need you to come work out here because I need an engineer." Sure enough, he was the first guy I hired. And he was my chief engineer and kind of my chief operating officer as I took over as CEO. And then I was at my 10-year reunion not many months later at West Point, and ran into my closest friend, Tommy Dyer, and I said, "Tommy, I need you to help me do something." And he's a marketing genius. He said, "What's that? Anything you want?" I said, "I need you to help me find somebody that can do the marketing at Humminbird." And he said, "Fine." He called me up in about 3 weeks and said, "It's me." I said, "No, it's not you." I said, "I'm not going to hire my best friend and have that. I'm not going to sacrifice our friendship for a work relationship." So he bought a ticket and flew down on his own and called me up and told me he was coming. And he walked in the front door, and I walked out the front door, and Roger Bryant talked to him. And Roger told me that evening, he said, "I do not think you ought to penalize the company for having the person you need working here because of your relationship." So I said, "Okay, if you want to hire him, you hire him." So I hired Tom, and then through another God thing, I go to a Rotary Club meeting at the country club in Eufaula. I see a guy sitting at the table that I hadn't seen for 16 years. He was an All-American tackle at Georgia Tech. He was a freshman at Tech when I played on the freshman football team. He was the nicest guy I'd ever met. He was high school All-American from Eufaula, Alabama. He was Bobby Dodge's captain of Bobby Dodge's last football team, Orange Bowl team. Played pro ball for a couple of years, and then got his master's degree at Tech, 4.0 student, and worked in a couple of manufacturing leadership jobs, and was being recruited by Yank Dean's father, who was president of the bank in Eufaula, to come down to Eufaula to be the next president of the bank. So I walk over and introduce myself, and he acted like he remembered me. I'm not sure that he really did, but I sure knew him. And his name was Bill Moore, M-O-O-R-E-R. He is the nephew of Tom Moore, Chief of Naval Operations. And nephew, he had two uncles. The other one was a 3-star admiral in the Navy. Admiral Moore Middle School is named after his uncle in Eufaula, Alabama. So long story short, Bill went to work for the bank for a couple of years. I was on the bank board. Bill hated banking. He and his wife were getting ready to leave Eufaula because he hated it so much. And I said, "How would you like to come to work for me at Humminbird?" And he said, "I'd love to." So I hired Bill. So I had the best marketing guy on the planet, Tom Dyer, and the best chief operating officer, production guy on the planet, and Bill Moore. And people often ask me, "Well, what do you do?" And my answer to that was, I do the things that nobody else wants to do. I do the grunt work. I do the strategic planning. I make them come to the meetings. I do the Monday morning meetings. I do the follow-up. I do the HR stuff. I do the performance. I make sure we do the performance reviews. I make sure we're developing our people. I make sure we're keeping them physically fit. They ran the business. But I was, you know, a lot of people that become CEOs were former engineers or former marketeers, or I consider myself a former HR guy. So I did it through the people. And so my focus was making sure that our people had the opportunity that they deserved, were compensated like they deserved, and if they didn't belong there, they were gone. And that's the reputation that Humminbird built over the 18 years that I was there. I populated the industry with people who excelled and were hired away by comparison. And people say, oh, no. I said, no, it's not. It's the best thing you can do. Because Humminbird had this reputation of developing the leaders for the industry. And to see somebody go on, the only thing I said to my folks was, if you get a better offer and you're getting ready to leave, come talk to me first so we can make sure that it's a better offer. And if it is, then you're going to go with my applause. And that's the approach we took. So I built the leadership team. Roger Bryant left. He was an entrepreneur, and he was one of these guys that was good for 2 years in a place, and 2 years, and 2 years, and 2 years. So it became Tom, Bill, and me. Well, the company grew from a couple of $1 million in revenue to about 6 or 7, and it was kind of a flat market, not a large market, about a $300 million market, but nothing exciting happening. We were starting to duke it out with Lawrence Electronics, which was the premier brand at the time. And so I felt like it was time for us to do something disruptive if we were going to build a company. And so I went to Tommy and Bill. At the time, when Yank died, praise the Lord, one of the things I did when I first went to work there, I heard about his congenital heart problem. And I said, do we have any key man insurance? And they did not. So I went to a friend of mine in Atlanta and said, how do I get a man with a congenital heart condition insured? And he said, well, you can get it done, but it'll be expensive and it'll be kind of a one-off policy. So I got $1 million life insurance policy on Yank, which had been issued 2 weeks before his death. And this is, you know, people ask me what I do, the details. I'd also put in a buy-sell agreement so that if something happened to Yank, it wouldn't bankrupt the company. His wife would be taken care of. So we put in a buy-sell agreement. We put in a formula for the buy-sell agreement, and we put in this $1 million life insurance policy. So when he died, $1 million life insurance policy paid off, redeemed the stock from Yank's wife, which took care of her. And so I said to Tommy and Bill, back to my comment about you get a leader in there and you develop a leader, they can go run their own business. Well, Tommy and Bill could run their own businesses. And so I decided the only way to retain Tommy and Bill would be for them to become significant owners of the company. So we met one evening in my office and I said, if each one of you owned 25% of this company, do you think it would be enough to satisfy you to stay here and build a life and a company with me? And they said yes. And so with Yank's death and the redemption of the stock, I own 98% of the company. So I sold them both 25% of the company each with a never pay me back note that would only have to be paid back if we exited the company or something, or took it public or something like that. And then the three of us gave 20% of our stock to an employee stock ownership plan. Because I said, if we're going to build this company and we're going to be rewarded for it, the people who pull the wagon are also going to be rewarded for it. And by the way, I had an anti-nepotism rule. Nobody from any of the three of our families could come to work at Humminbird, because it's the people who pull the wagon that get rewarded. So we did that. And after 9 product failures, we tried to innovate, and there's an Inc. magazine article, 1989, that tells the chapter and verse of this. The name of the article is Ask and You Shall Receive. So after 9 product failures as an owner, and not doing very well, and running out of cash, and I might say that going back to Linda and the buyout, in order to buy out the original shareholders, I had to pledge my $25,000 net worth. And Linda and I had to sign a personal note for $14 million from North Carolina National Bank. And the reason we got the loan from North Carolina National Bank is that there were a couple of great loan officers, A. But B, the chairman and CEO of NCNB was a guy named Hugh McCall. And Hugh McCall was a Marine. And Hugh McCall had been in combat. And I met Hugh McCall. And when we asked them to loan us this money, which was an asset-based loan, it pledged everything we had, all my $25,000 net worth, all the assets of the company, and about a $600,000 airball, which was not covered. And he said, will you pay me back? And I said, I'll pay you back. And they loaned us the money. There's not a bank in the country that would have done that, and certainly nobody today. Paid them back 3 years. Paid them back 3 years, by the way. But Linda signed this $14 million note with me, which, you know, is a little bit of a joke when you got $25,000 worth of assets to your name. So we bought the company. That's how we bought the company. And then we put this money in the ESOP, and off we went. And we, over the next 12 or 18 months, we fell on our face with 9 product failures. And so Dyer, the finest marketing man on the planet, said, you know, we need to go ask the customer what he wants and stop listening to the professional fisherman, the distributor salesman, our own salesman. Let's go to the customer. Let's see what the consumer wants. So we went to the customer, and we probably invested $75,000, which is about all we had left, into some market research. And we thought that we were going to be directed to what the bells and whistles that we need to put on these units to make the customer want them. Customer came back and said, we can't see it in bright sunlight. It's too hard to use. There are too many knobs. And we can't find it where we shop. So, a couple of things. Talk about disruptive. You talk about putting it on the line. And as I reflect back, this is the advent of what we carry around in our pockets. It's called a cell phone. So, what do you mean you can't see it in bright sunlight? Well, you know, the Super 60, the flasher, you get it's reflected. So, LCDs were about this big, about the size of a watch at that time. So I took my top engineer, a guy named Al Nunley, and said, Al, I want you to go to Japan, and I don't want you to come home. You take 6 months, I don't want you to come home until you find a liquid crystal display, because you can see liquid crystal displays in bright sunlight, that we can use for a fish finder. So he goes to Japan, and after 2 or 3 months, and meeting with Hitachi, well, they're getting ready to produce the first in the world ever, the LCD screen about this big, for a laptop computer. And to make a long story short, and after my 17 trips to Japan I made, and worked my way up to the chairman of Hitachi, $60 billion Japanese company. Linda and I went to the opera with them because they liked the opera. I fell asleep during the opera. But it was building a relationship with the Japanese. We convinced them to let us be their beta site for this laptop computer LCD. And so, and this screen, and they were just setting up their production lines. First LCDs ever mass produced in the world. And they were probably costing them about $3,000 a piece to make. Well, you can't put a $3,000 LCD into a fish finder that sells at the store for $200 or $300. So we convinced them to let us be their beta site, and they sold us those LCD screens to get their lines running for $300 a piece. For 2 years, we were the largest consumer of LCD in the world. And Hitachi got their lines running. And we introduced this liquid crystal display unit called the LCR. We also listened to market research about needs to be easy to use. 2 buttons, on and off, features. Then we did what people thought we had absolutely lost our minds over. When the customer says you're not selling it where we're shopping, this was the advent of the catalog. Bass Pro Shops was selling out of the catalog, and that's how a lot of the lures and things were being sold. And there's a company called Walmart, which was doing about $600 million, located in a little place as inaccessible as Eufaula, Alabama, Bentonville. And so our salesman and the distributor salesman said, if you sell those catalogers, and if you sell those guys who go direct to the retailers, we'll cut you off and you'll never sell us another depth finder, because 100% of our business went through distributors, marine distributors, and wholesale sporting goods distributors. So the risk was, do we go to the catalogs and to Walmart and lose this business, or do we stay where we are? And we broke, and we became the whores of the industry. And by the way, when we did that, the whole market expanded about 300%. And we went from about a 2% market share in the marine electronics business to a 48% market share. And I was invited to Bentonville by Sam Walton. We'd given them our Distributor of the Year award, and he invited me to talk to his 7 a.m. meeting in Bentonville, Arkansas, where they flew everybody in, and they met every Saturday morning, talked about what they were going to do the next week. And they asked me to come and talk to their group. And so we planned, and the guy who arranged it said, Jim, you need to be prepared to talk for 5 minutes or 45 minutes. Just depends on what Mr. Sam wants to do. So I walk in, and they do a few introductions, and we've got Jim Balkcom, I guess, from Humminbird, and by the way, we went from, let me just back up on that story just to fill in a little bit. The first year that we introduced the LCR, Walmart didn't sell any. So I wrote Sam Walton a personal letter because he was touting Buy America. Now, you don't wave an American flag in front of me unless you mean it. So I wrote him a letter and said, literally, put your money where your mouth is. You've been saying buy America. You're buying Japanese fish finders. Here's a little town in hometown America, Eufaula, Alabama. Well, his senior salespeople just had a fit and came after me and said, you'll never sell it. We'll never let you talk. I got a letter back from Sam Walton, and they sold $6 million worth of fish finders the next year. So he invites me in to the meeting. So I stand up and I tell about Humminbird. We show it, quick film, and I sit down. About 15 minutes later, he says, Jim, I understand that Humminbird has corporate values. I said, yes, sir, we do. We've got 6 corporate values, and every member of our staff at Humminbird and Eufaula has them memorized, and I walk around on the production floor every morning, and I'll ask somebody to recite them. If they can recite them, I'll give them a $5 bill. At our associates meetings every month, we'll draw somebody's name out of a hat, and they come up and recite the corporate values, and I'll give them $50. And so we made believers. And so I went through my corporate values, and he was just mesmerized. So I sat down, and about 30 minutes later, they were going through store openings and all that, and he said, Jim, where do we need a Walmart in Alabama? I said, you need one in Eufaula. 6 months later, a Walmart opened up in Eufaula, Alabama, which has been a boon for the whole area. I've got another Sam Walton story, which I'll bring you up on in just a minute. But Humminbird was about corporate values and about people. It was 6 months after Yank died, I put in a no smoking program at Humminbird. Now this is 1978. Well, my corporate attorney said, you can't do that. You know, that's a human right. They can smoke. They can do. I said, this is before FedEx did it. This is before anybody did it. And my attorney said, you're out of your mind. So what I did, I said, we're going to ban smoking in 6 months, team. And anybody in this plant that smokes, if you quit smoking for 6 months, honor code, and come tell me you have quit smoking, I'll give you a check for $5,000. Well, to this day, 40 years later, I still have people that call me on the phone and say, thank you for helping me quit smoking. I brought in the American Cancer Society. They ran classes on how to quit smoking. They helped people with the chewing gum and the stuff that you can use to quit. And we did that for 6 months, and at the end of 6 months, we drew the curtain and banned smoking. Not just in the plant, but on the property. 4 years later, my insurance company reported to me that we had the lowest cost per capita of health insurance of any company in the United States. We put in a program where the Houston Clinic had a guy who was kind of their other medical, other than orthopedic guy, and he came down every 6 months on a voluntary basis. I let employees get in line to have a physical. So we started giving physicals. We put in an exercise program, and I said we put a big map up on the wall. I said, you can pick any spot in the United States that you want a round-trip airplane ticket to. And once you have run or walked that many miles, we'll give you the ticket. So we put in, what I learned is that almost by accident, that when you do things like this, people say, you know, they really care about us. They care about our health. They care about our families. They care about our well-being. You know, what dawned on me was, you know, the population in Eufaula, Alabama, then and today is rural white, and rural African American, 50-50. By the way, my kids went to schools there, and they wouldn't trade anything in the world for it. Both have their MBAs. Both got accepted to every school they applied to. Lynn and I even had a consultant come down and to tell us if we ought to send our kids off somewhere to school, and he said, they get here what other people don't get. You know, they don't need to be away from their parents. They get the quality of life here. Back to the employee programs that we had in place. The other things that we did was that I insisted that we reviewed every employee every 6 months. I felt like every employee had the right to know how they were doing, and that's the one thing they wanted to know. In order to do that, I had to train supervisors how to do that. Because the one thing, we called them associates, the one thing that an associate wanted was to know how they were doing. And the primary thing they wanted to know was, what were they not doing well? The one thing that a supervisor has the hardest thing telling an employee or an associate is what they're not doing well. They love to tell them all the things they're doing good, but anybody that's given a review knows how hard that is to be straight with somebody, which is all they want to know. So that's why we trained our supervisors over and over and over again. So everybody got reviewed every 6 months, and we added a block at the end which said something like, what would you like to do for the rest of your life? I had a guy that wanted to be a Chick-fil-A franchisee. Yeah. You know, I realized that people are not going to work at Humminbird for the rest of their life. So what can we help you prepare for after you're not here at Humminbird? And which became a very important part of the review. I wrote letters for and helped this young man get a franchise at Chick-fil-A. You know, but I've got to say to you that and I trained our supervisors, once you've given a review to somebody 2 or 3 times and you're saying the same thing, it's time for them to go. So we had the reputation of, if you go to work for Humminbird, A, you're going to bust it all day. You're going to work all day. We had a break in the morning and a break in the afternoon where we had music come on and we did stretching exercises. But for that, you worked. And so we had people that come to work for us for 3 weeks and leave and say, can't keep up with the pace. I'm just not going to. So we really had a great culture of caring and of working your butt off. So Humminbird grew, and in about 2 years, from $16 million to about $90 million. I mean, it was a rocket ship, and I'll tell you that I managed that very, very poorly. I just wasn't ready for the acceleration. It was just something that we couldn't keep up with, I couldn't keep up with. The biggest problem, we went from 150 employees to 450 employees. You cannot bring 450 employee or the addition into the corporate culture overnight, because people come in and say, who are these people kidding? What is all the, what is this patronize and all this stuff they do? So your core group builds a lot more slowly. So that was one of the biggest difficulties I had with growth was the people we had to bring in to sustain the growth that were not a part of the culture. And that was something that we just had to work on every day, every day. So we became the darling of the industry, the wonderful success story. And then in 1989, George Bush I, who I'm a great fan of. He's a fisherman. He used to call me on the phone and ask me about his fish finder while he was sitting in office, about his transducer. I mean, somebody'd say, George Bush's office is on the phone. Will you take the call? I said, yes, I'll take the call. And as a matter of fact, I've got a picture, which I use in some of the talks I give, out of Time magazine. It's a picture of George H.W., W, and Jed in the boat up there in Massachusetts, in the, whatever the bay is up there, cruising, and it's got a great big hummingbird on it with a hummingbird logo across it. It's the biggest advertising, Time magazine. So anyway, George Bush I, who I dearly loved, as I said, puts in a luxury tax on boats. If you remember, he'd said no new taxes, and he put a luxury tax on boats, which unintended consequences, which put all the boat manufacturers, I say all, I'm literally 90% of the boat manufacturers out of business. Did it hurt the owners of the boat manufacturers? Did it hurt the buyers of large boats? No. It hurt the workers. So it put the workers out of business. So 1989, 1990, the marine industry shrank 55%. So we go from a run rate in January of 1990 of $120 million to a run rate in June of $30 million. And I'd just done a leverage recap and levered the company with $60 million worth of debt, which is the best and the worst thing I'd done. I'm going to back up again and tell you why it was the best thing I'd done. Because when we did that leverage recap, we decided to liquidate the employee stock ownership plan. And the happiest day of my life in business is I sit here right now today, and I've run 4 or 5 more companies. Was standing on the floor, on the production floor at Hummingbird, and handing out the checks for that 20% that we'd given to the employee stock ownership plan, and handing out checks to about 150 employees who are rural Alabama for hundreds of thousands of dollars each, with tears streaming down every face, to include mine, which I'll probably do in a minute, and watching them buy their first homes and their first cars, and watching them send their kids to college. And we had an employee that worked in the repair department who didn't have running water. And that's what I call the great American story. So we did that about 6 months. Providential. God looking after us. God directing us before we hit the wall. And when we hit the wall, we hit the wall. And it looked like I was going to have to bankrupt the company. In a community where you go to church and the grocery store with all your employees, we went from 450 to 225 employees in about a 6-week period. And I talked to every one of them as they went out the door. I had tears in my eyes, and they understood, because one of the things I did, one of the things I've learned is that when you're going through change in a company, you over-communicate. So I had a daily meeting. Every employee that worked there, every associate knew what was happening. It was happening in the marketplace, knew what was happening financially. And I brought in, there's an old proverb, and I can't quote it, that says, when you're going down an unknown path, it's best to get somebody alongside of you that's been down that path before. So with my brother's help, I hired a turnaround consultant, a guy named Dan Morris, who I love to this day, and I've talked to a month ago, and brought him in, and he helped me, and he says the best thing I did for him was get out of his way. He helped me do what had to be done, which probably I couldn't have done emotionally on my own. And so we went from 450 to 225. And then I went around and met with all the vendors and told them we're in trouble. And we did a reorganization outside of bankruptcy. It looked like a bankruptcy, but we did it without taking bankruptcy. And so I said to the vendors, if you want your money today, this is with Dan Morris helping me, coaching me, I'll pay you 50 cents on the dollar. If you want your money and you want to go, if you're afraid I'm going to go out of business. If you give me 2 years, I'll pay you 75% of your money. If you give me 4 years, I'll pay you all your money back. As I sit in board meetings today, I espouse, and I've been on a couple of public boards who are worried about shareholders. If you take care of your customers, if you take care of your employees, if you take care of your vendors and treat your vendors like customers, the shareholders will be taken care of. So the banks agreed to stand still. They were going to foreclose on us and put us out of business, and I was going to have to take bankruptcy. So I go to a meeting in New York City with a bankruptcy attorney, with Dan Morris, and with my corporate attorney who'd been with me, one of my dearest friends now, and sit down with all the parties, you know, on the 15th floor of some big skyscraper in New York, the Bank of Boston. And they said, I tell you what, the bank said, if you will prepay us $15 million down on your debt, we'll give you 6 months. So, okay. I called Sam Walton. You can say all the bad things you want to say about Walmart. They prepaid us $15 million in product that we would ship at a later date to get the banks to stand still. So I present this to the banks in New York City. And the banks take the $15 million, apply it to the debt, and renege on the deal. And say, we're going to foreclose. I stood up in the meeting and I said, I can do a lot of things, but I can't do things with people without integrity. I said, I'm flying home and I'm going to release the workforce. You need to get security to guard the doors or whatever you want to do for your property that you're going to foreclose on. So I got up, I wasn't dramatic about it, I just said, it's over. I saw my life passing in front of me. And so I got on an airplane and flew home, and Bob Hill, my corporate attorney, who's a dear friend, said, you guys don't know Jim, but I wasn't a bluff. He thinks it's over. And so I got to Atlanta airport. Again, this was before cell phones. They paged me in the airport. Jim Balkcom, please come to, whatever phone, and so I go to the phone and it's Bob, and he said, the bank's agreed to stay with the deal and give you the 6 months. So over the next 6 months, with the help of our vendors, with the help of customers, with the help with everybody, we pulled the thing out just before it nosed in, and built the company back up to about, we're down at $30 million, built it back up to about 80, and that's when we sold the company, and that was a tough deal. But it's spiritual with me. I think everybody has a time. I think people ask me, why'd you sell? And I said, well, I'd contributed all I could contribute. My time, it was somebody else's turn. And having been through that experience in 1989, this was 95 now, I was about out of gas. And I said, somebody else's turn. And we exited, and look, it's a great American story. Blue collar kid from Chamblee, Georgia does well. And obviously, when we did our leverage recap back in 1987, we took about half our chips off the table. And then with the downturn we went through in '89, and praise the Lord, we liquidated the employee stock ownership plan. It really diminished the value of the other 50%, but still blessed beyond anything this kid ever thought he would earn in the marketplace. Now I need to tell you that when you tell the hummingbird story, except for that dip, it looks like one of these. I have to tell you another story. Just after we introduced the new liquid crystal display fish finder, 3 of our angel investors and former directors decided that they would sue us because they didn't think they got enough money for their stock. And mind you, that the introduction of the LCR was 2 years after we bought the company. I mean, I didn't know what a liquid crystal display was back here. But they thought there was some money in it for them if they sued and we settled. So on the front page of the Eufaula Tribune, which is published twice a week, above the fold is a picture of Jim Balkcom. And my kids are in the Eufaula schools, and they're in the 11th and 7th grade or something like that. Picture of me, it says, Balkcom sued for fraud. Well, if you've never been through something like this, you don't know, but of course everybody thinks you're guilty until, and here's a guy who made a lot of money and did well, and he deserves to get smacked. Well, your name's all you got. Your honor's all you got. So we were involved in a 27-month lawsuit, which again is one of the hardest things I've ever been through in my life. And it is a story I could talk about for an hour, but to keep it short, I still hold a record in Alabama for the longest deposition. They took my deposition for 8 days, 8 hours a day. I lost 10 pounds. But they couldn't find what they wanted. But we went to court in front of a jury of my peers in Jefferson County, Alabama, which is where no company in the United States ever wants to get sued. And with everybody at Hummingbird on their hands and knees praying, and with Linda and Paige, Tommy's wife, and Marcia, Bill's wife, praying for us, and flying to Birmingham every day. We were in trial for 17 days. And they wanted to, about halfway through the trial, they wanted to settle. And this was eating us up. And I said, well, maybe the smart thing to do is to settle. But you know, you can sue me for a lot of things, and I'll settle. If you sue me for fraud, you're going to have to see me in court. So while we were having settlement discussions, Linda's on her knees by the bed praying that Jimmy will not settle, because he'll never get over it if it's settled and nobody ever really knows. Well, they threw the securities fraud out immediately. And I mean, they said there's no way it can be securities fraud. It's 2 years later. So you know, but they kept it in. You know, did we defraud these guys? And Warren Lightfoot, my defense attorney, who I just talked to a few days ago, writing his memoirs, this was his case of his career. And of course, they had me on the stand, and I broke down. I mean, it just, you know, it was about to kill me. And we had the plant praying. It was just incredible, the whole experience. So the jury goes out, comes back. The closing argument, my defense attorney quotes from the Bible and says, give Jim Balkcom his good name back. And there were 10 counts. Not guilty on all 10 counts. Not a dry eye. We flew back in on a little King Air to Eufaula, landed at the Eufaula airport. I have this on video. All employees lined the airstrip with balloons. And we landed and had a meeting and some more tears. So it wasn't a straight line from 2% market share to 48% market share. It was some. But had it not been for the values, had it not been for the spirit of Hunter, the day that Yank Dean died and I was standing in front of 13 employees, I was without words. And so I said, would you bow your heads with me? Let's pray. And we prayed for Yank and his family and for us and for going forward and all that. And so at every associates meeting for the next 18 years, we prayed as a company together. Now, I had a lady who was Hindu. I had some folks who were agnostic. I had some people who, I mean, the first employee meeting we had, and we finished reciting the corporate values, and I said, bow your heads with me, and I started praying, and people were going, who is this kook, and what is he up to? Well, you do that every month for a few years, and people started saying, you know, I think he's serious. And so by the time I left, I'd say 10 years into praying, before every associates meeting, I'd have a line of 12 or 15 employees outside my door saying, would you pray for my mom? She's going to have an operation next week. Or, you know, I never will forget Kathy, her grandson had spina bifida, was going to have an operation in Birmingham. So, I mean, so we got to, as a company, we got to witness intercessory prayer working. And I'm going to tell you another story that I think this is all about. Great friend, the guy who ran our public relations, a guy named Larry Colombo, who's in the freshwater sport fishing Hall of Fame. I often said you couldn't put Larry out with 10,000 gallons of water. Just the best PR guy in the world. Larry was a little bit of a rounder. And he, after his divorce, he dated young women, and he used to stand in the back, I'm talking about for 18 years, and look out of the corner of his eye at me and say, Balkcom, what is all this praying about? And never got into it. Never got into it. 2 or 3 years after we sold Hummingbird and I had moved back to Atlanta, I got a call from Larry. It was Tuesday. I remember this like yesterday. Balkcom, Miss Colombo. Hey, Colombo, what's going on? Hey, can you come down here this Sunday? I said, what's up? Well, I'd introduced him to my pastor. I was a deacon at First Baptist Church of Eufaula, and Ken Bush, the pastor, was a dear friend. And Ken had an outing for the hunters in the church every year where they cook venison. So I'd introduced him to Larry to do the cooking. He was kind of the chef for these things. So he said, so Larry, back to the conversation, Larry says, can you come down here Sunday? I said, Larry, I'll do anything you want. And I'm in town, but it's a 2.5 hour drive. I'll come down there. What's up? He said, I'm going to walk down the aisle and accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and I want you to walk down the aisle with me. And so I would say to you that, as the Bible says, inasmuch as you have done it to the least of one of these, you've done it to me, that maybe, just maybe, when I get to heaven, that I'll learn that the only reason that God sent me to Eufaula, Alabama was for Larry Colombo. So in 1995, I left Hummingbird. We'd sold the business a year before, and as Tom and Bill and I say, I drew the short straw, so I stayed on for a year, and they went off into the sunset. And then after a year, I left, and after a couple of more years, and then I moved back to Atlanta because my dad was aging and her mother was aging, and we cared for them until they passed away. I had gotten a call the day after I exited from a private equity firm. They had 2 or 3 companies they wanted me to think about running, and I told them no. They said, well, we'd like to hold one of them till you make your mind up. And I said, no, I'm going to take a year off. Actually, I said I'm going to take 6 months off, a sabbatical. Never taken any time off in my life. When I hadn't ever traveled much. Most of my friends thought I'd go to seminary and go into ministry. My friend Ken Bush, who I told you about, the pastor, grabbed me by my lapels one day and pulled me up to his face and said, don't you ever think about going into the ministry. You touch more people than I can ever touch by running businesses. And so I decided to take some time off. I was able to hire a man from California. He was the chairman of religious studies at Cal State University at Fullerton. And he was on his 2-month break or whatever, and through a Young Presidents Organization meeting, and I was talking about what I wanted to do, they said you ought to meet George St. Laurent, who's since passed away. And so George was the greatest teacher I've ever known. He was a Catholic priest who married a Catholic nun. They'd never been alone until the day they were married. And had 2 children, just a wonderful guy, but he was out of work. Became chairman of Cal State University at Fullerton. He was transformed as a teacher. So I spent a month with George. We spent 2 weeks in a retreat house in Montecito, California, studying the 5 religions of the world, the 5 great religions of the world, and what we as Christians can learn from them. And then we flew back to Atlanta, picked up Linda, and went to Israel. And with Bibles under our arm, we tromped the footsteps of Jesus and the old biblical times and all that for a week or 10 days. And then we went to a YPO University in South Africa. This is 95. And we got to hear and meet and touch Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and the Prime Minister, I'm going to think of his name in a minute, I can't remember right now, that ended apartheid. It was just a spiritual experience to be with those people and to hear Nelson Mandela talk. And Linda's not a hero worshiper, but she said to me in the cocktail party, I want to touch him. So I said, well, you see that security, there's a, guys poured arms line. I said, you see that line of security? She said, yes. I said, we're going to walk over there. And I'm going to tell them what we're up to. I'm going to lean in against one of them, and you stick your hand out. So I talked to the guy, and he said, I got you. And so I leaned in as Nelson walked by, Nelson Mandela. And Linda stuck her hand out and said, thank you for, and she said, I didn't know what to say, but and he just said, God bless you, and walked on. So it was a kind of a highlight for Linda. And then Linda flew home and I flew back to Vietnam. I just had to bring closure to Vietnam because it was such an intense experience for me, and I had left so much of me on the ground there. And there was a little convent, a monastery about halfway down the mountain that was manned by sisters of the Catholic Church, and it was a leper colony. And we used to take food and things down there, so I had a need to go back there, and I had a need to rub elbows with the children in Vietnam. I went down on the beach, down the Bay of Quy Nhon, and the children would just swarm around me, and I had a need to get back up on the mountain. And so I went back and I hired a 17-year-old guy and a moped, and put on my jeans and a shirt and got on the back of his moped, and we drove around the area where I served, and went to the museums, which I couldn't stay in very long because they were all dedicated to the killing of Americans. And the most unique, the spiritual experience from that was that he said, my dad was a guide for special forces in Vietnam. I said, no, I didn't know that. I said, well, he said, well, he was sent to a concentration camp for about 6 or 8 years after the war, and my mom worked a spice stand until she could earn enough money to buy his way out. And I said, where is he? He says, he's at home. And I said, can I meet him? He said, absolutely. So we roared down a little dirt street, back streets of Saigon, and a little concrete building with dirt floors. I stopped and bought a 6-pack of beer and put it in my rucksack, and got there and went back, and there's this slight, diminished man sitting in the corner, and I walked in, and in better English than I speak, he greeted me and told me that what had happened to him in the concentration camp, and that he had fought with the Americans. He'd led patrols. He had been there at the death of many American Rangers, and so I broke out the 6-pack, and popped open a beer, put it in front of him, and he raised it and he said, "Here's to the good old days." he said, you know, it's just not the same under communism. So that was a wonderful experience going back to Vietnam. So I kind of closed it. I've got my classmates who fought over there said, gee, I didn't like it the first time. I don't want to go back. And I said, well, I had to finish what I started, make sure they were okay. And so from that, I did a bike trip with one of my daughters in Ireland, and you know, and just took some time off. And 366 days to the date, the private equity guy called me back up and said, "I got a company. I want you to go." So I went to help out a business as an executive chairman up in Norcross, about a $650 million large distributor. You know, people ask me, I mean, it's crazy. You know, how do you go from fish finders to distribution to colonoscopies to, you know, what is it? And I said, well, you know, it's all about people and process. There's nothing magic about, you know, if you got strategy, you got people, you got processes, and you got the spiritual part of it. So I was in a Bible study as I was getting ready to go back and I went back and I was executive chair of this company. We took it public. We had a system failure with a new IT system that we'd implemented. And we had some issues. There were some issues with the CEO. So the private equity group decided to terminate the CEO and said, Jim, would you step in for 6 months? And I said, yes. And so I stepped in for 6 months. That's when the IT system failed. So I got to wrestle with that. But I got a call from one of my mentors, one of my spiritual mentors, I was in Bible study with him. He said, Jim, I want you to be careful. I said, what, Gail? What's the problem? He said, well, you've been down in Eufaula, you've been down in Bible Belt. I know y'all pray together and all that. Now, you're coming up here to Atlanta, and you need to be careful with all that. We've got alternative lifestyles. We've got, you know, all kinds of religions. You just watch yourself with your praying and your spirituality and all that. And I said, thank you, Gail. So I thought and prayed and all that. So terminated the CEO, and the day that I was to take over this company, which had about, I don't know, 2,000 employees. And there were about 300 headquarters in Norcross, and the rest were in branches around the country. And so I stood up in front of the group, and they introduced me as the new CEO, interim. And I took a deep breath. And I said, would you bow your heads with me, please? We bowed our heads. I prayed for them. I prayed for the man who'd just been terminated and his family. I prayed for wisdom. I prayed for, and so I said my prayer, and amen. And I said, now we're going to take a 10-minute break. And if I have offended anybody, I want you to come up here and see me right now, and we'll start this meeting in whatever time it was in 10 minutes. So I said, so let's take a break. We took a break. Well, immediately a line formed in front of me of about 12 or 15 people. Most of them were women, and half of them were African American. 100% of them were crying. 100% of them hugged me and thanked me for letting them bring their spirituality to work and not check it at the front door. And Bible studies sprung up. My vice president of HR was Jewish, wonderful lady. Well, I'd studied the Jewish religion a year ago with my buddy out in California. My receptionist and my receivables clerks were Muslim. Well, I studied Islam. And so with them, I would celebrate Ramadan. With them, I would respect them on their holidays and their prayer time and all that. So we had probably a half a dozen gays that worked for us. My first exposure to that. If Jesus were here today, that's where he'd be spending his time. So I loved and respected them just like I did everybody else. And they knew where I stood, and I knew where they stood. So I told that story at one of our Bible study retreats. And Gail came up to me and said, I really want to apologize. You know, you shine the light where it needed to be shined. Worked with that company. We got it turned around. Brought in a new private equity owner, sold it to them. I moved on. About 3 days later, I get a call from the guy who I'd recruited to run Eufaula Bank and Trust when Mr. Dean was there. During my sabbatical, pro bono, I'd helped him put together a strategic plan. He executed on it. He'd grown the bank from $60 million to about $350 million in the Panhandle. Starting to have some difficulties in Florida, real estate, et cetera. He said, I've got, my board is split, and half the board wants to fire me and half the board wants to keep me. They've agreed to a standstill agreement if you'll come chair the board. And I said, Greg, you know, you're in Eufaula, I'm in Atlanta. You know, some of these guys are my best friends on both sides. He said, will you do it? So I agreed to do it for him. I said, but here are the conditions. The conditions are that we'll have our board meetings in Atlanta, because I was still winding down this thing at Pamico. So we'll have board meetings in Atlanta. We'll have them when I want to have them. And I want the resignation of every director before I'll take the job, and I'll pick the directors that stay. And what had happened, even some of my closest friends had gotten greedy. And it was about their personal agenda. And I have a rule about being on a board. I don't sit on boards with people with personal agenda. And so, so I took the job and kept 3 of the directors and let 5 of them resign. One of them, whose mayoral campaign I'd run in Eufaula, who's a good friend, but personal agenda. So we got the bank turned around, and I sailed off from that. And then the private equity folks called me up again. And I went out to California and helped turn around an undercar remanufacturing parts roll-up, and got that turned around and left that, and came back to Atlanta. And about this time, Katie Gamble, who is a lady, and her husband Ben, who Lynn and I become very, very close friends with in the Young Presidents Organization. And we travel with them, and you know, they watched our kids grow up, we watched their kids grow up, and she and her partner, Denny Bottorff, who had just left as chairman, CEO of, I think, American National Bank in Nashville, I can't remember the name of it, was starting a venture capital fund and wanted me to be a founding partner. And I said, no, I don't do VCs. I've had VCs on my boards, and they just drive me crazy, and frankly, I detest them. As a matter of fact, I had been asked to speak. Emory has a Venture Capital Conference of America or something every year, and they'd asked me to come speak about directors being on the boards of VC companies. And knowing that I'd never be invited back, I told them what I thought about VCs. And I started my speech off, I was at the podium, and I took out my cell phone and I stuck it under the podium and started acting like I was texting. And I said, do you know what this is? And everybody blank stare, and I said, this is a VC at a board meeting. He doesn't pay attention to what's going on. He's emailing or doing somebody else. So, was never invited back. And I gave him my rules for sitting on boards, which I'll talk to in just a second. But anyway, after about 3 or 4 months, Katie convinced me that this was different. And as a matter of fact, it's turned out to be 25 of us who founded the company were ex-CEOs. And this is 16 years later, and we're in our 3rd fund. I sit on the CEO Council and the investment committee. And so I have chaired about, I don't know, 6 or 7 of our investments. And it's just coaching the CEO, and which is what General Coles told me to do. Go do it for somebody else. And so I've just loved doing that, and it's been effective. I've had to let some go. I'm a great believer in once you reach your level of incompetence, it's time to move on. The second biggest exit that we've had at Council Capital is with a company, and I had to ask the founder and CEO to step aside because the business was outgrowing him. And 3 years later, I sent him a check for $10 million, and we're best friends. I mean, he understood it. He was a salesman, and he understood what was going on. I've got a couple of companies I've been on where I waited too long to do that, and still making those mistakes. But I have 2 requirements. And I've now been on about 24 boards, so 23, 24 boards. Never been asked to leave one because I'm a great believer. It's the normal distribution curve. I'm a great believer that when you outrun your use, you leave. And so I resign when it's time for me to go. And I think there need to be term limits. I think there need to be all kind of limits for directors. So once I make my contribution, I go on to another one. Because just like at Humminbird, I think I'd outrun my ability to grow it any further. So it's time for somebody else. But I have 2 requirements when somebody asks me to sit on a board. One is that we will start every board meeting with a devotional. And I've got Israelis that sit on one of my boards. Because I think that the first thing we need to do when we sit around the table at a boardroom is to recognize the fact that we live in the United States of America. And we didn't have anything to do with it. We didn't have anything to do with the color of our eyes. We didn't have anything to do with the parents. God selected all that. And whether you're an immigrant or whether you were born here or you're in America, where the free enterprise system exists uniquely. So we will give thanks for that. And then number 2, sometime during the first or second or third board meeting, you will have to sit for Balkcom's empirical discussion on how you run a board and how you run a board meeting. And I have, and my brother was a big help to me. My brother was a consultant for his career and sat with some of the largest boards in the country, IBM and Sears and Allstate and all that. And so I learned from Johnny, I learned from National Association of Corporate Directors, I learned from experience. The place that I learned the most from was YPO, because I was in a forum and I went to forum moderator training. And I tell young folks, and I coach and mentor a lot of young folks who are in transition like I was when I left the bank. I said, there are 2 things that you really need to do. One is you need to learn how to run a meeting. And 2 is I went to Speakeasy, a public speaking course, twice. I'm a slow learner because you're always speaking. I don't care whether you're speaking to your sales force or speaking to your platoon or speaking to, I had to speak to 600 people when we were given when Humminbird was awarded over Federal Express the Positive Employee Practice Institute Award of the annual award of the year for our practices. Where you're speaking to 600, you're always speaking. And you need to get comfortable with it. I'm an introvert. And so Linda, my wife, who's an extrovert, and these courses have helped me learn how to get outside of myself and be comfortable speaking. So you need to learn how to run a meeting, and you need to learn how to speak, is what I tell young folks to start with. So anyway, the syllabus is about 45 minutes. It talks about being a director. And it talks about how you run a meeting. And it talks about Robert's Rules of Order, which I bring with me and stick on the desk. An interesting phenomenon is that I've often been asked to sit on a board. And I'll sit on a board and I'll go to 2 or 3 meetings and not say a word. And then third or fourth meeting, I'll ask a question or I'll say something. And the next meeting they'll ask me to chair it. So Robert's Rules of Order, in my view, is a lot of words for respect. Because running a meeting is about respect. It's about respecting what other people have to say. It's about respecting other people's time. It's about respecting your attention. So I have rules. Don't have my cell phone with me, but you will turn your cell phone off before you come into a board meeting. And we will take a break every 50 minutes for 10 minutes because I have a small bladder. So everybody can go to the bathroom and you check your cell phone. You come back in, you turn it off. Because the most rude thing in the world is if I'm speaking to you and you're looking at your cell phone. Secondly, we will obey Robert's Rules of Order. If somebody is speaking, you will not interrupt. You raise your hand and get my attention, I'll acknowledge it. I'll call on you when they finish speaking. Thirdly, meetings start on time and end on time. We will have, and Robert's Rules of Order will tell you, the point of order, if your pre-approved agenda has times around each agenda item that you're out of order if you go past that time. Now, if we run out of time, if we run out of time, we will go to the next item, and if we have time, we'll come back to it, or we'll take it offline. But because I respect your time and know that you've got other things to do besides sit on this board, I will start it on time and I'll end it on time, because those are 2 first points that Robert makes of Rules of Order, of you being out of order, is you don't start on time or end on time, because I respect you. Now, I'd bring some humor to it. I have a yellow penalty flag that I bring with me. And when people can't help themselves and they speak, speak out of turn, they get a, or if I see somebody flip open their laptop to look at it, they get a penalty flag. And so we laugh about it. And I've got a guy who is one of the smartest guys I've ever met. And we're trying to get him to join another board of ours who interrupts all the time. He's ADD. And he is really ADD. And so I give him 3 little tickets. I mean, this is a guy who's run billion-dollar companies. So people wonder if I'm being disrespectful, but I'm not. I mean, I'm trying to make humor of it. But I give him 3 little tickets, and he gets 3 blurt outs. And if he blurts out more than 3 times, he has to go out of the room, and then we bring him back in. But I've done this, and I got to tell you, it takes somebody like me to take a deep breath, and it takes a lot of brass to talk to these guys who are smarter than I am, who've got more experience than I've got, who've made a lot more money than I've made, and I go through these rules 100% of the time. First break, they come up to me, and 1 or 2 or 3 of them will say, "Thank you. I wish all meetings were run this way. Thank you for how you run your meeting. I appreciate you shutting so-and-so down." And it's just amazing how how that has worked. So today, I am the chairman of one of our investments, TMG Gases, which is a market maker for distribution of gas, all kinds of gases. Gases that machinists use, welders use, machinists. We do a big business in healthcare gases, everything that's used in the emergency room to your dermatologist, nitrogen, burning your stuff off your skin. And it's a wonderful business run by a wonderful leader. And I'm just a facilitator. Then I was chair. I was the original chair of EndoChoice, which is a medical technology company in the endoscopy part of the business side of the house. I was chair for about almost 6 years, and I said, you know, I've given all I can give, and we've got the ex-chairman CEO of UPS on our board, and we've got the ex-chairman and CEO and founder of about a $500 million med tech company, and I said, you know, some of these guys ought to take this to the next step. So I now chair the governance committee, which will not surprise you. They still left me in charge of how the meetings are run and those kinds of things. But that's been great. Got a great young CEO who I've just had the privilege to serve for about 6 years. And I chair the advisory board of Talent Quest, which is a human capital business, which is near and dear to my heart. Frank Merritt, who I've used for probably 35 years in team building and assessing people. I think it's, you know, holding the mirror up to people so they can see who they are and what their strengths and weaknesses are. He's shown me mine twice, and you know, and I never hired anybody in a senior position since Humminbird without an assessment from Frank and without my wife meeting them, because women have a sixth sense. And I also am chairman of the Independent Directors Committee of State Bank. And Joe Evans, the founder of the bank, and I go back about 3 banks of his banks. And you know, and Joe's chairman, and I just chair I'm the lead director. I said, well, I got to be the chaplain, you know that. And he said, got it, so I want you there. So we start every meeting with a devotional. One of the things we've done at State Bank, which I'm doing on all the boards, I said, I learned 10 or 15 years ago that if you put a woman on the board, you raise the level of the whole operation. I don't care if a chairman of UPS is on your board. If you put a woman on the board, you change the level of the conversation, you change the interaction, you change the intellectual capacity, you change it all. I mean, I don't have to tell anybody here that men and women think differently. And we need the other way of thinking. And so since I've been lead director at State Bank, we put 3 women on the board. We just lost one because she took another. She's a senior position at Home Depot, and she took a position on another board and had to get off our board, so we put another woman. We're replacing her with a woman, so we'll still have 3. It's just critical, and we have African American who chairs our audit committee on the bank, and there is so much strength in diversity. It's just something that I've, again, empirically learned over my years. One of the things I've done at this point in my life is I've tried to add some space for me and for my family, as opposed to the heydays at Humminbird when I was gone all the time and working all the time, and Linda and I have had a partnership. I mean, I could not have done anything I have done without Linda. A, she agreed to it. A, she helped me hire people. B, C, she took care of the kids. And now Linda would tell you the kids always knew they had a dad. I worry about that because I travel a lot, but I am close to my children. And I got 5 grandkids. And when they call now, they get first shot. If they had said to me Friday, I need you to do something on Monday, I would have canceled this because I did it the other way when I was in the saddle. So that's kind of been a change. And other than that, I'm just trying to give back what so much was given me. So many people came alongside me. At Humminbird, and I think boards of directors are so important to young CEOs. At Humminbird, even though we own 95% of the company, I went out and looked, and you have to be intentional about selecting your directors. I needed somebody with a distribution background. I needed somebody with electronic background. I needed somebody with a new product background. So I was able to lure the executive vice president of 3M to sit on our board at Humminbird. And he flew down from Minneapolis. Now, he was a fisherman, so he liked sitting on the Humminbird. He liked that. I met him at a fishing show. But in 3M's annual report for the last 25 years, you will see it stated that 20 or 25% of their revenues every year will be from new products. And so here's somebody who had a new product machine, and I wanted some of that, and I wanted his guidance. I wanted somebody that knew distribution, because I don't care what business I've been in, med tech, banking, fish finding, it's all about distribution. You know, even banking is distribution. And so I was able, with Jimmy Williams' help, who chaired SunTrust at the time, to get Earl Doleve, who was the Vice Chairman Emeritus of Genuine Parts, the greatest auto parts distributor in the world, to sit on my board. And he told me before he died, and he was at my girls' funerals and my girls' weddings, and I was at his funeral. He said, Jimmy, it's the most fun I've ever had sitting on any board. And so he'd come to the board meetings, and he helped me through the lawsuit I talked about and through the downturn. He stood there right there with me and held me up through that whole thing. And I wanted somebody who understood high-speed electronics, because we were getting into high-speed electronics, and was able to lure Bob McCollum out of, he was the CEO of Tandy Electronics, and this is just back when cell phones were starting to, and he had high-speed electronics making Tandy Electronics. And so he sat on, he flew his own airplane over to come to our board meetings. And so I just believe in that so much, because I mean, and I made them feel like they owned the company. Because when they told me to do something, by golly, I was coachable. I did. I will say that a strength of mine is that I have a great handle on what I don't know. And so I have needed a lot of help, and I've gotten just the greatest help. In YPO, I used to bring in resources. I used to hire consultants. If there's an area we're going off in, I say, whoa, I know nothing about it. I'd go find the best person that I could find to do that. And that's what this board helped me with so much. I've been a student of Robert Greenleaf, Servant Leadership Institute, for about 30 years. He was a consultant at AT&T that first really wrote about servant leadership back in the day. And his little booklet, a little orange booklet called The Servant as Leader. It serves as a Bible. It's the hardest read I've ever read, and I've probably given 1,000 of these booklets away to the people that I coach and mentor. And I tell them you got to read it about 5 or 6 times before you understand it. But you know, any leader is a servant first, and leadership is all about serving others. People ask me about being civilian aid to Secretary of the Army. that gives me an opportunity to serve the troops. It has nothing to do with Secretary of the Army. I don't care who he is, I serve the office. It gives me opportunity to go do things for the troops that the Army can't do for itself. We have injured troops. I'm on the advisory board at Shepherd Center, and we get a lot of the brain injuries and a lot of the spinal injuries of the troops, especially special operations people. And then I get to do things with their families that the Army will never know about and they can't do. And so it gives me an opportunity to serve those who are serving others. But I think that's what leadership is all about. If you're serving others, they're growing and they become leaders. So Greenleaf says you're a servant first, and then you make a decision to become a leader. But a leader is just another level of serving. That's all it is. I think if you stop serving, then you stop leading. Nothing transcends transparency and integrity. In bad times and in good times, people want to know the bad news as well as they want to know the good news. One of the things that helped me with the culture at Hummingbird was that as I stood in front of those employee meetings, they saw me mad, they saw me sad, they saw me happy, they saw me cry, they saw me yelling, and they knew who I was, and I think that's integrity, as well as transparency with what's going on. I think you pour yourself into other people. I think you invest in other people. I moved back to Atlanta from Eufaula under the radar, which I loved, and without making a phone call, without doing anything, for the last 15, 16, 17 years since I've been back in Atlanta, I have breakfast or lunch with 2 or 3 young people a week in transition who are going through something, who need somebody to help them with a move from one job to another job or starting up a company. And Linda says, where do they come from? God sends them over. Don't know. It's just networking, and people will say, well, you ought to spend some time with Jim. And that's really been my ministry. That's what my pastor said to me. That's really been my ministry, my give back. And I've done some professional coaching for Frank Merritt, but don't do much of that. I don't like to do it for pay. Linda would tell you that, quote, Jimmy's not the smartest guy in the world, but he's never met anybody he can't outwork. And I think that is the privilege I got from being born poor and being born blue collar and having to work my way through high school and then through college for the first year. And so I think that was a real advantage for me. I worry about my kids. It's not their fault that their daddy's got some money. So I worry about that.